Let's take a look at our top story this hour. Students from around the world have come back to the streets for a global climate strike. The protest movement that was started by Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg lost momentum after the COVID-19 pandemic. The organisers of the strike have now called for a rally on a global scale. Now, students across the world are protesting and demonstrating for meaningful climate action. Greta Thunberg kicked off the Fridays for Future movement from Stockholm. The climate activist is leading the global movement for action on climate change. According to the climate activist, the climate strikes will be held in over 3,000 places around the world. Now let's get you more on this from DW's Malte Roa-Coleman in Berlin, Germany, where across good afternoon, thanks for being with us. Now, across the country, more than 400 protests are taking place. And after being halted due to the COVID-19 restrictions, these climate protests have now started up again. How are people protesting in Berlin?
Well, in Berlin, they have organized a bike ride and they have organized a sit-down protest, which, of course, is a challenge with social distancing measures in place. And just as if that wasn't a challenge enough for the organizers, it's also a pretty rainy day. So we'll have to see how many people in the end show up. But regardless of how many people show up, many are actually taking their protest online, as organizers have asked them to stay safe in times of a global pandemic. Across the country here in Germany, we're expecting 400 protests in cities, different cities and towns, and across the world a staggering 3,000, with many, of course, also taking place in India.
Right, Malte, you've touched on it. Expand more on how this pandemic has actually affected the movement.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, protest movements have had a pretty tough time, haven't they? Because large gatherings of people were just not the thing to do anymore all of a sudden. If you look back at the climate strike about 1 year ago, millions of people across the world took to the street, and it's going to be very hard to imagine that in these times. So what has happened, like so many other things, the climate strike protest has moved online largely. But we also kind of have to have a look at the public discourse in general. If we go back to the beginning of the year, Greta Thunberg, the Swedish climate activist, had just been, announced as the Time Person of the Year 2019. It looked like climate change and the environment were going to be dominating topics of 2020, but then of course the pandemic struck and attention somewhat shifted onto that. But protesters are saying now, look, just because the attention shifted, the climate crisis isn't over. Bangladesh is flooded, there are fires in the US and all over the world. There are these freak weather accidents, and that's what they're out on the streets for and on social media to call attention to.
Absolutely. We have seen some encouraging visuals throughout the pandemic from various parts of the world. Have the lockdowns around the world helped lower the emissions in any meaningful way?
They absolutely lowered the emissions. I mean, if we see that, factories didn't produce for a certain time, passenger air traffic was down 90% at some points. And also a lot of people stayed at home and didn't use their car. And all this added up to about a 20% reduction in global emissions. Now, the question is, as you asked, will this have any meaningful effect? And a study is rather disappointingly said, not really if we go back to business as usual after that. Then it will only contribute to a lowering of temperatures of 0.01 degrees by 2030. What we should do instead is have what the authors of the study call a green recovery. So invest in renewable energies, invest in more sustainable modes of transportation, and obviously that's very much in line with what the protesters on the streets and on the internet all across the world today are demanding as well.
Malte, thank you very much for that report and analysis there.